The morning sun cast long shadows across the private aviation terminal at JFK International Airport as Dr. Maya Richardson pulled up in her Tesla Model X. It was 7:15 a.m., precisely 45 minutes before her scheduled departure to Los Angeles. The early autumn air felt crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel that always lingered around airports. Maya checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting her navy blazer and ensuring her shoulder-length braids were neat. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of standing in operating rooms and saving lives. Her hands, steady as always, gathered her leather briefcase containing her laptop and the keynote speech she would deliver at the International Neurosurgery Conference. The parking attendant smiled warmly at her as she handed over her keys. "Good morning, ma'am. Flying out today?" he asked, printing her parking ticket. "Yes, heading to Los Angeles for a medical conference," Maya replied, her voice carrying the gentle authority she'd developed over her 15 years as a neurosurgeon. Walking toward the terminal entrance, Maya's heels clicked rhythmically against the polished floor. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, a tailored navy blazer, cream silk blouse, and matching navy slacks. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Dress like the professional you are, baby girl. Make it impossible for them to question you belong there." Inside her briefcase, along with her conference materials, was a folder containing multiple copies of her credentials, flight confirmation, and ID, a habit she'd developed over years of experiencing subtle and not-so-subtle questioning of her presence in prestigious spaces. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. The private aviation terminal stood apart from the main airport, all glass, chrome, and exclusive luxury. Maya had used private jets several times before when hospitals required her immediate presence for emergency surgeries. Today's flight was different, though. As the keynote speaker at the conference, the organizing committee had arranged this private charter, insisting their star speaker travel in comfort. Several other passengers milled about the terminal's luxury lounge, mostly older men in expensive suits who barely glanced up from their phones. A young family sat in one corner, their children quietly playing with tablets while their parents sipped premium coffee. The scene was one of practiced privilege and casual wealth. Maya approached the check-in counter first, where a friendly young woman named Jessica quickly processed her information. "Dr. Richardson, welcome. Your flight is on schedule for 8:00 a.m. Would you like some breakfast while you wait? Our chef makes amazing omelets." "Just a green tea, thank you," Maya replied, accepting her boarding documents with a smile. She had learned early in her career to keep her stomach light before flights. As she moved toward the security checkpoint, Maya noticed something shift in the atmosphere. The security guard stationed there, whose name tag read Thomas Wells, had been casually chatting with a white businessman who had just passed through. However, when his eyes landed on Maya, his expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a cloud passing over the sun. Maya took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. She'd seen that look before, in hospital boardrooms, at medical conferences, in upscale restaurants. It was the look of someone who had already decided she didn't belong, before she'd even spoken a word. Approaching the checkpoint, Maya had her documentation ready, her ID, boarding pass, and medical credentials neatly arranged. She maintained eye contact with Wells, her expression professional and pleasant. Years of dealing with difficult situations in the operating room had taught her the value of remaining calm under pressure. "Good morning," she said clearly, extending her documents. Wells didn't immediately respond to her greeting. Instead, he took her documents with exaggerated slowness, examining each page as if searching for hidden flaws. Behind her, Maya could hear more passengers entering the terminal, but Wells seemed in no hurry to complete his inspection. The air grew thick with tension as seconds stretched into minutes. Maya remained still, her posture relaxed but dignified. She'd earned her place here, in this terminal, in the operating room, in every space she occupied. No amount of unwarranted scrutiny could change that fact. Little did Maya know that this moment, this seemingly routine checkpoint encounter, would spark a chain of events that would not only challenge deep-seated prejudices, but also lead to meaningful change in an industry long overdue for transformation. "These credentials," Thomas Wells said, holding up Maya's documents. "I'll need to make some additional verifications." His voice carried a hint of satisfaction, as if he found an excuse he'd been looking for. Around them, other passengers continued to pass through security with barely a glance at their papers. Maya noticed a young white couple being waved through just seconds after showing their IDs. The woman wore yoga pants and carried a designer bag, while the man was dressed in casual golf attire. Neither was asked for additional documentation or verification. Is there a specific concern with my documentation? Maya asked calmly, though she felt her heart rate increasing. She'd faced similar situations before, but it never got easier. Her phone felt heavy in her blazer pocket. She knew she might need it soon. Wells spread her documents across his desk, making a show of scrutinizing each page. Protocol, he said shortly, not meeting her eyes. We need to be extra careful with private charter flights. Security concerns, you understand. Behind Maya, a line was forming. She could hear the murmurs of other passengers, some impatient, others curious about the delay. A few had their phones out, sensing the growing tension in the air. I've flown private charters from this terminal before, Maya said, keeping her voice steady. I'm a neurosurgeon heading to deliver a keynote speech at the International Neurosurgery Conference. All my credentials are in order, as your colleague at check-in already verified. Wells picked up his phone, making a show of dialing numbers. Need to check with the charter company, he mumbled, though Maya noticed he wasn't actually pressing the call button. He was stalling, creating a spectacle. Two other security guards stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but not intervening. Maya could read the conflict on their faces. They knew something wasn't right, but hierarchy and workplace politics kept them silent. Mr. Wells, Maya said, loud enough for others to hear, I'm concerned about the unequal application of security protocols I'm witnessing. Would you please explain why other passengers aren't requiring the same level of verification? Her words caught the attention of several nearby staff members. A young baggage handler stopped what he was doing, watching the scene unfold. The check-in attendant, Jessica, was now on her phone, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. I don't need to explain security procedures to passengers, Wells replied, his face flushing. If you have a problem with our protocols, you can file a complaint or book a different flight. Maya reached into her pocket and calmly took out her phone. In that case, I'll need to document this interaction. I'm also going to contact my lawyer, who happens to be on speed dial. She began recording, holding the phone steady. No recording allowed in security areas. Wells snapped, his composure cracking slightly. Actually, came a new voice. Passengers have the right to record interactions with security personnel in public areas of private terminals. The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, the terminal's operations manager, who was walking briskly toward them with a concerned expression. Wells straightened up, suddenly looking less sure of himself. Miss Chen, I was just following. I've been watching on our security cameras, Sarah interrupted. And I've received 3 separate calls from staff members about this situation. She turned to Maya, her expression apologetic. Dr. Richardson, I am so sorry for this unprofessional treatment. I recognize you from your recent appearance on Medical Horizons discussing your groundbreaking work in pediatric neurosurgery. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted. Several passengers who had been pretending not to watch now looked at Maya with recognition. Wells stood frozen, his face a mix of embarrassment and defiance. Your credentials are more than in order, Sarah continued, gathering Maya's documents from Wells's desk. Please, let me escort you to the passenger lounge. Your flight is preparing for boarding. As Maya followed Sarah, she heard whispers of recognition from other passengers. One woman was already on her phone, apparently looking up Maya's medical credentials and achievements. Wells remained at his post, but his authority had crumbled visibly. Other security staff were now openly watching him with disapproval. The young baggage handler who had witnessed everything shook his head and walked away, pulling out his phone, likely to share what he'd just seen on social media. This confrontation would have been easier to walk away from, to let it become just another story of everyday discrimination. But Maya knew that sometimes standing firm and documenting injustice was the only way to create change. As she walked toward the lounge, she was already thinking about how to turn this moment into something more than just another incident report. In the private terminal's luxurious waiting area, Maya sat with perfect posture on a leather armchair, her phone still recording. Sarah Chen had brought her a fresh cup of green tea, which sat untouched on the glass table beside her. The terminal manager's concerned face reflected in the large windows that overlooked the runway. "Dr. Richardson," Sarah said, sitting across from her, "I want you to know that this kind of behavior is not what we stand for. Mr. Wells's actions today," she paused, searching for the right words, "are not unusual," Maya finished for her. "And that's precisely why I can't just accept an apology and move on." Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the smoothness. Through the terminal's glass walls, she could see Wells still at his post, now treating every passenger with exaggerated politeness. Other staff members kept glancing their way. A young black janitor named Marcus had slowed his cleaning routine nearby, clearly listening while pretending to wipe already spotless surfaces. His face showed a mix of pride and concern as he watched Maya handle the situation. "What happened this morning isn't just about me," Maya continued, meeting Sarah's eyes. "How many other travelers have faced similar treatment, but didn't have my resources or platform to speak up?" As if on cue, Marcus stepped forward, finally finding his courage. "Ma'am," he addressed Sarah, "I've seen Mr. Wells do this before. Many times, especially with passengers of color." His hands gripped his cleaning cart tightly, but his voice was steady. Sarah's eyes widened. "Why hasn't anyone reported this?" "Who would believe us?" Marcus asked simply. "And who wants to risk their job?" More staff members began gathering nearby. Jessica from the check-in counter joined them, carrying a folder. "I have documentation," she said quietly. "I've been keeping notes of incidents I've observed over the past 6 months." Maya looked at these people, the cleaning staff, the check-in agents, baggage handlers, all coming forward now that someone had finally cracked the wall of silence. Her medical training had taught her that treating symptoms wasn't enough. You had to address the underlying cause. "Sarah," Maya said, turning back to the manager, "I could file a complaint. I could call my lawyer and make this a legal issue, but I'd rather help you solve the real problem here." The growing group listened intently as Maya continued. "I conduct diversity and bias training sessions at my hospital. Not the kind where people just check boxes and watch outdated videos, but real conversations that change minds and behaviors." Sarah leaned forward, interest sparking in her eyes. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting we use this moment to create actual change," Maya said. "But first, I need to know if you're truly ready to address the systemic issues, not just this single incident." Through the windows, they could see Wells watching their gathering, his face a mix of confusion and concern. He clearly hadn't expected his actions to spark such a response. A flight attendant who had been preparing Maya's charter plane joined the group. "Last month," she said, "Mr. Wells made my cousin miss her flight with similar extra security checks. She was traveling to her father's funeral." The stories kept coming, quiet at first, then with growing confidence. Each person who spoke seemed to stand a little taller, as if laying down a heavy burden they'd carried for too long. Maya pulled out her laptop and opened a new document. "Let's document everything," she said. "Times, dates, patterns. Change requires evidence." Sarah watched as her employees gathered around Maya, each waiting to share their experiences. The terminal manager realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just the aftermath of discrimination, but the birth of a movement for change. "Your flight?" Sarah started, glancing at her watch. "Can wait," Maya said firmly. "I'll call the conference organizers and explain. Some things are more important than being on time." The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as Maya listened and typed, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. What had started as one woman's stand against discrimination was transforming into something larger, a moment of collective courage that would reshape policies, attitudes, and lives. Marcus, still standing nearby with his cleaning cart, smiled slightly as he watched Wells shift uncomfortably at his post. Sometimes, he realized, change didn't come from grand gestures or loud protests, but from one person calmly refusing to accept injustice. Sarah Chen's office became an impromptu meeting room that morning. The space, usually neat and formal, now buzzed with energy as staff members sat wherever they could find space. Maya's laptop screen showed a document filling up with dates, times, and detailed accounts of past incidents. 17 similar incidents in the past 3 months alone, Sarah said, her face pale as she looked at the evidence. She sat behind her desk, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in front of her. The morning sun streamed through the window, highlighting the worry lines on her face. Just then, a knock on the door made everyone turn. Thomas Wells stood in the doorway, his security uniform suddenly seeming less crisp than usual. Behind him stood Mr. Richardson, Maya's husband, who had driven to the airport after receiving her call. "Come in, Mr. Wells," Sarah said firmly. "And Mr. Richardson, thank you for joining us." James Richardson, a civil rights attorney, moved to stand behind his wife's chair. His presence added weight to the moment. He placed a gentle hand on Maya's shoulder, but remained silent, letting her continue leading the conversation. "Mr. Wells," Maya said, her voice level, "would you like to explain why you felt the need to single me out this morning?" Wells shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I was just following security protocols," he mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. "These protocols?" James asked quietly, pointing to the screen where Jessica had pulled up the official security guidelines. "Because I don't see anything about extended verification processes based on a passenger's appearance." The room grew very quiet. Through the office windows, they could see planes taking off in the distance, their sounds muffled by the thick glass. Maya's original flight had long since departed, but that seemed unimportant now. Wells started, then stopped. He looked around the room at the faces of his coworkers, people he'd worked beside for years. Many avoided his eyes, while others met his gaze with clear disappointment. Marcus, the janitor, spoke up from his corner. "Last week, you let that white businessman through even though his ID was expired. Remember that, Mr. Wells?" Wells's face reddened. "That was different," he protested weakly. "How?" Maya asked simply. "Help us understand your decision-making process." The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah Chen stood up from behind her desk. "Mr. Wells, your actions have exposed this terminal to serious legal liability. But more importantly, you violated the trust of our passengers and your colleagues." Wells seemed to shrink in his uniform. "Are you firing me?" he asked quietly. Maya leaned forward in her chair. "Actually, I have a different suggestion." All eyes turned to her. "Firing Mr. Wells might feel like justice, but it won't solve the larger problem. Instead, I propose we use this situation as an opportunity for real change." She opened a new document on her laptop and began typing. "First, mandatory bias training for all security personnel, not just here, but across all private aviation terminals. Second, a clear reporting system for passengers and staff to document discriminatory treatment. Third, regular reviews of security footage to ensure consistent application of protocols." Sarah nodded slowly, then added, "and quarterly meetings where staff can safely discuss any concerns about discrimination they've observed." James Richardson pulled out his own laptop. "I can help draft the legal framework for these changes," he offered. "Make them binding and enforceable." Wells stood silently, watching as his colleagues began building something new from the ashes of his mistakes. His face showed a mix of emotions, shame, relief, and perhaps a glimmer of hope. "Mr. Wells," Maya said, drawing his attention back to her, "you'll be the first to go through the new training program. And afterward, if you're willing, you could help identify other areas where bias might be affecting security procedures." The tension in the room shifted slightly. This wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about transformation. Even those who had been angry with Wells seemed to straighten up, engaged by the possibility of real change. Sarah picked up her phone. "I'm calling corporate right now. They need to know what happened here today and what we're planning to do about it." As the morning turned to afternoon, Maya's missed conference seemed less and less important. Sometimes, she realized, the most crucial operations didn't happen in an operating room. Sometimes, they happened in quiet office spaces where people found the courage to face uncomfortable truths and work toward healing. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the terminal windows, more stories began to surface. Sarah Chen's office had become a safe space where years of silence were finally breaking. Staff members from different shifts came in during their breaks, each carrying their own experiences like heavy stones they could finally put down. Lisa, a flight attendant with 10 years of experience, sat on the edge of Sarah's desk with tears in her eyes. "Last Christmas," she said, "there was this black family, dressed in their holiday best. The children were so excited about their first private flight to visit their grandparents." She paused, gathering herself. Mr. Wells made them wait 2 hours for additional security checks. Those kids missed their grandmother's Christmas Eve dinner. Thomas Wells, still present in the room, sat in a corner chair. Each story seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't left, though he could have. Something kept him there, listening to the impact of his actions. Maya had moved from her laptop to a whiteboard, creating a timeline of incidents. Different colored markers tracked patterns: red for denied boardings, blue for excessive delays, green for complaints that were ignored. The board told a story that couldn't be dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. In March, Marcus added, stepping forward again, there was that group of Asian business executives. Remember how Wells insisted their corporate documents might be fake? He looked directly at Wells now. They took their multi-million-dollar contract to another airport after that. Sarah Chen nodded slowly, making notes. That explains why the Zhang Corporation canceled their regular charter services. She turned to Wells. Do you understand the scope of what your actions have cost? Not just in business terms, but in human dignity. James Richardson, who had been quietly typing on his laptop, looked up. I've compiled the initial data, he said. In the past year alone, minority passengers were 3 times more likely to face extended security checks at this terminal. The pattern is undeniable. Maya watched as Wells's face changed. Something was breaking through, perhaps the sheer weight of evidence, or maybe the raw pain in his colleagues' voices. I didn't. Wells started, then stopped. He stood up suddenly, moving to the whiteboard. May I? He asked Maya, reaching for a marker. She handed it to him, curious. Wells began marking certain dates on the timeline, adding his own notes in black. These dates, he said quietly, they were days after I got passed over for promotion, and these, he marked another cluster, were after my son started having trouble at his new school. He's one of only 3 white kids in his class. His hand trembled slightly. I think I was bringing my frustrations here, taking them out on people who didn't deserve it. The room fell silent. It wasn't an excuse, and everyone knew it, but it was something else. A crack in the wall, a first step toward understanding. Jessica from check-in pulled out her phone, scrolling through pictures. Look at this, she said, showing them images of happy passengers in the terminal. This is what we should be about. Every passenger, regardless of who they are, sharing the same joy of travel. Sarah turned to her computer, pulling up the terminal's mission statement. To provide world-class service to all who pass through our doors, she read aloud. All, not some, not just those who look a certain way. Maya stood back, watching the scene unfold. What had started as her personal confrontation with discrimination had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. People were finding their voices, sharing their stories, and most importantly, being heard. Thank you, a quiet voice said. Everyone turned to see Emily, one of the newest security officers, standing in the doorway. I've been afraid to speak up about what I've seen. I was worried about losing my job, but seeing all of you today, she straightened her uniform. I want to help make things right. Wells looked at his young colleague, then back at the whiteboard filled with incidents. I did this, he said, more to himself than anyone else. But maybe I can help fix it too. Maya checked her phone. Dozens of missed calls from the conference organizers. But what was happening in this room felt more important than any medical presentation. Sometimes healing had to happen at a deeper level, starting with the truth and working its way toward understanding. The afternoon light continued to fade, but in Sarah Chen's office, something new was dawning. 1 week after the incident at the terminal, Maya stood at the front of a conference room in the same building where she had been denied entry. The space looked different now. Rows of chairs faced a large screen, and every seat was filled with security personnel, not just from this terminal, but from 3 other private aviation facilities in the area. Thomas Wells sat in the front row, his uniform pressed and badge polished, but his posture was different, less rigid, more open. Next to him sat Sarah Chen, who had spent the past week working with corporate headquarters to implement the new training program. Change, Maya began, clicking to her first slide, doesn't start with policies. It starts with understanding. She wasn't wearing her doctor's coat today, but she approached this training with the same precision she brought to her surgeries. On the screen behind her, a series of photographs appeared, travelers of different races, religions, and backgrounds, all captured in moments of joy or anxiety at various airports. Each image told a story that felt personal to someone in the room. Last week, Maya continued, we had a moment that could have ended with anger and legal action. Instead, it became an opportunity. She glanced at Wells, who nodded slightly. Wells stood up, taking his place beside Maya. This was part of their agreement. He would share his story, not as a punishment, but as a pathway to understanding. His voice shook slightly as he began. For 15 years, I thought I was doing my job, he said to his colleagues. But I was really just acting on fears and prejudices I didn't even know I had. He pulled out a small notebook. These are all the people I wronged. I've been writing down every incident I can remember. The room was silent. Through the windows, they could see planes taking off and landing, carrying people to their destinations without knowing the changes happening here on the ground. Sarah Chen stepped forward next, holding up new security guidelines. Starting today, every security check must be logged with clear reasoning. Random selections will be truly random, tracked by computer. And most importantly, we're establishing an anonymous reporting system for both staff and passengers. Maya clicked to the next slide, showing brain scans. This is what bias looks like in the brain, she explained, pointing to colored areas. But here's the amazing thing, our brains can change. New pathways can form. Old prejudices can be unlearned. During the break, Marcus the janitor approached Wells. Never thought I'd see this day, he said, offering Wells a coffee. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. Wells accepted it with trembling hands. Jessica had set up a display in the corner, showing the new reporting system on a tablet. Staff members gathered around, learning how to document incidents properly. The atmosphere was focused but hopeful. In my operating room, Maya continued after the break. We have a saying, check your assumptions at the door. Lives depend on seeing what's really there, not what we expect to see. The same is true here. As the training progressed, something shifted in the room. People began sharing their own stories, not just about discrimination they'd witnessed, but about their own biases they were beginning to recognize. A young security officer raised her hand. Yesterday, she admitted, I caught myself getting nervous about a group of Middle Eastern passengers. But then I remembered this training was coming up, and I asked myself why I was really feeling that way. Wells nodded in understanding. That's the first step, he said, catching yourself in the moment. Maya watched as her impromptu curriculum took root. This wasn't the kind of healing she usually performed, but in many ways, it felt just as important. Toward the end of the day, Sarah brought in something unexpected, a large world map. She hung it on the wall and handed out pins. Put a pin where your family came from, she said. All of us were travelers once. The map slowly filled with pins, creating a web of connections that crossed oceans and continents. Wells placed his pin in Ireland, then stepped back, seeing how it connected to pins in Africa, Asia, South America, everywhere. This, Maya said, gesturing to the map, is who we really are, and this is who we serve. As the first training session ended, Maya felt tired but hopeful. Real change wouldn't happen in a day, but something had started here. Something that could grow and spread. One person, one moment, one decision at a time. On his way out, Wells stopped at the map again. Tomorrow, he would return to his post at security. But he would see travelers differently now, not as threats or stereotypes, but as people, each carrying their own pins, their own stories, their own dreams of reaching new destinations. 3 months passed since the training program began. The private aviation terminal had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. New signs in multiple languages welcomed travelers, and the security checkpoint now had clear, written procedures displayed for all to see. Thomas Wells stood at his usual post, but his demeanor had changed completely. On this particular morning, he was carefully explaining security procedures to an elderly Indian couple who were flying to their granddaughter's wedding. Please take your time, he said kindly, helping the grandmother understand where to place her traditional jewelry for scanning. Your flight isn't leaving for another hour. His voice carried a warmth that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. Maya, who had continued to work with the terminal part-time while maintaining her surgical practice, watched from near the coffee shop. She smiled as she saw Wells handle the situation with grace and respect. Sarah Chen approached Maya, carrying a thick folder of reports. "The numbers are in for the first quarter," she said, sitting down at a small table. "Complaints about discriminatory treatment have dropped to zero. And something else interesting, our customer satisfaction scores are up by 40%. Marcus walked by with his cleaning cart, now wearing a supervisor's badge. Part of the changes had included promoting staff members who showed leadership in creating a more inclusive environment. He paused briefly. "Did you tell her about the award?" Sarah's face brightened. "Oh yes, the Airport Management Association is recognizing us for our new bias prevention program. They want to implement it across other private terminals nationwide." Through the terminal windows, they could see a group of young black executives boarding their charter flight. No extra checks, no suspicious glances, just professional, courteous service. One of them waved to Wells as they passed. "Remember that family from Christmas?" Lisa, the flight attendant, joined their conversation. "The ones who missed their grandmother's dinner? They're flying with us again next week." Wells personally called them to apologize and offered them a VIP service upgrade. Maya opened her laptop, showing them her latest project. "I'm documenting everything," she explained. "The training methods, the results, the personal stories. It's becoming a case study for corporate culture change." The terminal's atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Staff members from different departments chatted easily with each other during breaks. The security team, once isolated in their authority, now integrated smoothly with the rest of the terminal community. Wells approached their table during his break, carrying his own folder. "Dr. Richardson," he said, still somewhat formal but friendly, "I wanted to show you something." He opened the folder to reveal letters, dozens of them. "These are apology letters," he explained. "I've been writing to passengers I remembered treating unfairly. Some have written back." He pulled out one response letter, his hands trembling slightly. "This one's from a young doctor I delayed last year. She missed an important interview because of me. She's accepted my apology and offered to speak at our next training session." Sarah checked her phone, smiling at an email. "Corporate just approved our budget for Phase 2, she announced. "We can expand the training to include cultural awareness workshops. They're even talking about creating a diversity officer position." Maya watched as a new group of travelers entered the terminal. Wells returned to his post, greeting each person with the same respectful attention. The elderly Indian couple from earlier waved goodbye as they headed to their gate, the grandmother touching her heart in a gesture of gratitude. "It's not perfect yet," Marcus observed, leaning on his cart. "Change takes time, but it's real change, not just for show." Maya nodded, thinking about her own operating room back at the hospital. She'd started implementing similar training there, recognizing that bias could affect medical care just as it had affected airport security. A young black girl walked past their table, looking up at the planes through the window with wonder in her eyes. Wells smiled at her and her parents, efficiently processing their documents without a hint of the old suspicion. "That's what it's all about," Sarah said softly, watching the family proceed to their gate. "Making sure every child who walks through those doors feels welcome." Maya gathered her things, preparing to head to the hospital for her afternoon surgeries. As she stood, she saw Wells training a new security officer, emphasizing the importance of consistent, respectful treatment for all passengers. The terminal buzzed with its usual activity, but now it felt different in a choice at a time. More open, more human. What had started as a confrontation had grown into something much bigger, a model for how real change could happen. One person, one moment. Oh, 1 year had passed since that pivotal morning at the private aviation terminal. Maya stood at a podium in a large conference hall in Washington, D.C., addressing a gathering of aviation industry leaders from across the country. Behind her, a screen displayed the title, "Creating Inclusive Spaces, a Model for Change." In the audience, Thomas Wells sat next to Sarah Chen, both wearing professional suits and visitor badges. They had flown in that morning to support Maya's presentation about their terminal's transformation. Wells no longer worked as a security guard. He had been promoted to diversity and inclusion coordinator for the entire airport system. "Change isn't just about rules and policies," Maya said into the microphone, her voice carrying across the packed room. "It's about creating a new culture, one interaction at a time." She clicked to the next slide, showing their terminal's impressive statistics from the past year. Sarah leaned forward in her seat as Maya continued. Our terminal's revenue has increased by 60%. Why? Because word spread about how we treat people. Private travelers choose us specifically because they know every passenger will be treated with respect. In the back of the room, Marcus sat with his new maintenance team. After his promotion, he had rebuilt the cleaning department from the ground up, ensuring every staff member felt valued and heard. His team now trained other airport maintenance departments in creating inclusive workplace environments. But the numbers aren't the whole story, Maya continued, switching to a slide showing photographs. These are the real changes. The images showed moments from the past year. Wells helping a Muslim family navigate security during Ramadan, Sarah conducting a training session, Marcus leading a team meeting. Lisa, the flight attendant who had shared the Christmas story a year ago, now appeared in one photo receiving an award for customer service excellence. She had started a program helping nervous first-time flyers feel comfortable with private aviation, regardless of their background. Our program has been adopted by 15 other private terminals across the country, Maya explained, as heads nodded in the audience. But more importantly, it has changed lives. She gestured to Wells, who stood up. A year ago, Wells said, his voice strong and clear, I was part of the problem. Today, I travel to airports around the country, sharing my story and helping other security personnel recognize and overcome their biases. He paused, looking around the room. It's never too late to change. The presentation switched to video clips of passengers sharing their experiences. A black CEO described feeling welcomed rather than scrutinized. An elderly Asian couple praised the respectful treatment they received. A Middle Eastern family talked about choosing their terminal specifically because of its inclusive reputation. From her seat in the front row, Jessica, now the terminal's head of customer relations, wiped away a tear. The simple reporting system she had helped design was becoming an industry standard, used by airports nationwide to track and prevent discriminatory incidents. This isn't just about one terminal or one incident, Maya concluded, showing a map of the United States with growing dots representing airports adopting their program. This is about changing the way we think about travel, about security, about each other. After the presentation, people crowded around Maya and her team, asking questions and sharing their own stories. Wells stood nearby, answering questions about the training program he now helped run. His face showed pride rather than shame when he spoke about his past and his journey to change. Sarah checked her phone, smiling at a message. Our terminal just got awarded the highest customer satisfaction rating in the country, she announced quietly to Maya. 5th quarter in a row. As they prepared to leave the conference hall, a young black girl approached Maya with her mother. I want to be like you when I grow up, the girl said shyly. My mom says you help make airports better for everyone. Maya knelt down to the girl's level. You can make things better wherever you are, she said warmly. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and speak out. Later that evening, as their plane took off for home, Maya looked out the window at the lights of Washington below. She thought about that morning a year ago, how close she had come to simply filing a complaint and moving on. Instead, that moment had sparked a movement that was still growing, still changing lives. In the row behind her, Wells was already planning their next training session. Sarah was reviewing requests from other airports wanting to implement their program. And somewhere below, in terminals across the country, travelers of all backgrounds were moving through security checkpoints, being treated with the dignity and respect they had always deserved. Some changes started small but grew beyond anyone's expectations. This one had started with a confrontation, but had grown into a legacy of transformation.